Hello and welcome to another episode of the Mastermind, Body, and Spirit Show. I'm your host, Matt Belair. Today's guest is an author whose worldview was turned upside down in late 2016 when he was exposed to world-changing science. After researching extensively, he wrote an End to Upside-Down Thinking to introduce the general public to these cutting-edge ideas, all in an effort to encourage a much-needed global shift in scientific and existential thinking. He is a senior member of Sherpa Technology Group, a firm that advises businesses on mergers and acquisitions and strategy. He previously worked on as an investment banking analyst in New York. He has been quoted for his opinions on business and technology matters in Bloomberg, Businessweek, and elsewhere. He has participated in several Summit Series events and has attended the annual TED Conference for the past 8 years. He graduated with distinction from Princeton University, where he was captain of the tennis team. Welcome to the show, Mark Gober.
Thank you very much, Matt.
What's up, brother?
Happy to be talking to you.
Yeah, man, I'm excited about this. I got your book just a few days before the podcast, and so I was away doing an event in Sedona, and I got to flip through, and as I did, I got more and more excited about this conversation because, number one, you're extremely intelligent. You're a Princeton man. That's amazing. That's great. Number two, you're exploring science and consciousness in a way that I don't know if I could ever get to that ability, but this is why I have the show, so I can have people like you come back with this incredible research and tell me what the heck you found. So why don't you give the audience a little bit of the background about who you are, how you got to where you are today in writing the book, and then we'll dive into it.
Absolutely. So all the things you said, Matt, those are the reasons I wrote it. I wanted to put things together for people in an easy to read fashion. So the background here is, if we had had this conversation about 2 years ago, I wouldn't have known about anything in the book. So this is all very new to me. My background's very traditional. Like you said, I went to Princeton, started off in the economics department because that's what a lot of people did there. Wasn't sure what I wanted to study. Realized that economics made the assumption that people are rational. And I was like, that doesn't make sense. People are not always rational, so we can't draw these fancy curves. So I wanted to do something else. And I thought about astrophysics because it was a really strong department and I wanted to understand how the universe works. So I took some basic courses and I thought it was awesome. But there was a problem because I was on the tennis team, which is Division I at Princeton, very demanding. I was later the captain, realized that I couldn't do astrophysics and tennis at the same time. So I decided to do psychology with a focus on behavioral economics. So I wrote my senior thesis on Daniel Kahneman's prospect theory. So he wrote the book Thinking Fast and Slow, which has become very popular. And it's all about how people make errors in judgment and decision making, in business or otherwise. So I had not, I wasn't really into the consciousness thing. I was somewhat exposed to it, but not really. It was more about how people make decisions. From Princeton, I went into investment banking starting in July of 2008. So that was right before one of the biggest financial crises ever hit. And I was at one of the large investment banks on Park Avenue that was going through issues. And my clients at the bank were the very financial institutions that were having problems. So banks and insurance companies were my actual clients. So not only was I at a bank, but I was advising other banks and insurance companies. So I was not sleeping. I think investment banking is tough for a normal person, but during that period it was even tougher. And I wasn't a finance guy. I was a liberal arts major. So I was working with other people who were, like NYU, Wharton, who were used to the finance thing. So for me, it was an adjustment on many levels. Wasn't sleeping, wasn't thinking about any of the existential stuff that had interested me in college. So I did that for a little under 2 years. I left New York to join my current firm, which is called Sherpa Technology Group. It's sort of like investment banking. We advise on mergers and acquisitions, and we also give strategic advice. So what does that have to do with my book? I mean, on the surface, it really doesn't have much to do with it. The book is kind of a side passion project. And about 2 years ago, I was listening to podcasts. I wasn't intending to get into this stuff. I was listening to health podcasts. And the first kind of exposure I had to this was a woman who described very paranormal things. Like she could communicate with non-physical beings. She could talk to dead people. And she didn't sound totally crazy, but I had never heard anything like it before. So I was like, this is kind of interesting. And then I ended up listening to more podcasts along that same type of topic, and I realized after a while of just listening, driving down the 101, I live in San Francisco, to and from the office, I heard enough people describe very similar things of kind of this idea that consciousness is existing beyond the brain, and that it's not localized to the brain, and that when our body dies, our consciousness doesn't die. I'm like, if this is real, then I need to rethink everything, because I was not in this camp at all. My perspective was, I think, what our scientific education teaches us, whether it's explicit or not, which is that consciousness comes from the brain. So I never even thought about that assumption, because it's so embedded in everything, is that I'm aware right now because of stuff happening in my brain, chemical activity, electrical activity. That's the reason I'm conscious. So if you take that very literally, which is what I did unknowingly, when your brain dies, when your body dies, what happens? It's over. Your consciousness is gone, because the producer of your consciousness, I thought, was my brain. So that has implications for how you think about your life. It means that your life has a finite amount of time. And I think that causes fear, probably at a level that I wasn't even aware of, and probably causes some sadness and just general, not being as happy as I could have been. Even though I was going along, my daily business, I probably had some angst at a level of thinking about existence. That all changed for me very quickly in late 2016 as I listened to more and more podcasts. And I was like, wait a second, there's no way that all these people are independently describing the same thing and that they're all lying or that they're all delusional. So I realized I had to look into it. And that was a multi-pronged approach. It was looking at the science, which I didn't even know existed, and we can get into that. My book is based on that science. But also I said, okay, well, if this is real, then I should be able to talk to different psychics and energy healers, and they should be able to do things. And sure enough, they were able to do things that I couldn't explain. I mean, not always, but there were certain things. It's like they couldn't have looked that up. How did they know it? And it was just lining up with all the research I was doing. So I kind of freaked out. Like Thanksgiving of 2016, I'm like, oh my God, what do I do? Because I'm living in this world where people are not thinking this way. At least in my day-to-day, people aren't thinking about consciousness existing beyond the body. That is such an out there topic in certain circles. And I'm learning there are a lot of circles where it's like commonplace. But I'm like, well, how do I live in this world? If I'm walking around realizing that we're like a physical form we're consciousness having the experience of a physical form rather than the reverse. We're not a physical body that has a consciousness. We're a consciousness experiencing a world through a body. Totally different. What do I do? So I thought about it a lot and ended up just going down the path of very intense research. So I spent a year outside the office where all I was doing was reading books. And I remember sending pictures to friends of the stack of books that was growing on my table and on my bookshelf. It was like, I couldn't read enough because I had to relearn reality, basically. All the stuff I was never taught, wasn't exposed to it at Princeton, even though I've now learned there was a lab called the Engineering Anomalies Research Lab run by the former Dean of Engineering. So we'll talk about that. I mentioned in my book. I didn't know it even existed. I learned about all this stuff. And as I was learning about it, I was telling family members and different friends, although at first I was skittish. I didn't want to talk about it because I thought it was so out there. But I finally got the courage to talk to people about it. And the responses I was getting from people, first of all, they were very interested. And then over time, people were like, Mark, this is changing how I'm thinking about my life. They started to have very positive changes. And I could see it in them because they were open to these ideas, or at least the possibility. And then the more evidence I exposed them to, it's like, wait, how can I reconcile my old worldview with this new evidence? I have to think about things differently. So enough people started to tell me that I was having an impact on them that I was like, okay, let me see what happens if I put this down on paper. So this is the story of how the book came about. I never had an intention of writing a book about anything or about being public about anything other than my business stuff. So this is new. July 4th weekend last year, it was a 4-day weekend. I said, okay, I have a lot of knowledge now. I'm just going to sit down and write. So I sat in my apartment for 4 days. I would get up at 7 a.m. and I would work until 1 a.m. because my body would start shutting down. In my investment banking days, I probably could have gone longer, but not anymore. 7 a.m. to 1 a.m., about 4 days in a row. And I came out of that weekend with more than half this book written, and then finished it over the next few weekends. So all of a sudden I had this book that I knew would have a major impact on people because it was like what I thought to be the strongest evidence in different areas. And So I'm like, well, what do I do with this book? I want to get it out. I'm ready to go. Let's let people read it. Let's get an editor and get it out there. And I had 2 different scientists look at it, and the opinions they gave me, they're both authors, is look, Mark, this is really good for a mainstream generalist audience. You should really try to get it out there to that type of audience. So apparently the way you do that is to get a literary agent. I had never even heard of that before. So I looked around, I saw a lot of agents in New York, and then a few people mentioned to me a man named Bill Gladstone. And Bill represents Eckhart Tolle. He represents Dr. Irvin Laszlo, who's a 2-time Nobel Peace Prize nominee, Neil Donald Walsh, Barbara Marx Hubbard. So some big authors in the space. So I'm like, oh, this guy sounds like someone who would be aligned with me. So I sent him an email and said, hey, I'm looking for an agent who's philosophically aligned. Here are a few sample chapters. Here's my proposal. And this is the basic summary of the book. He responds the same day and says, this resonates. Here's an agreement. We just got to get you more exposure because you don't have any exposure as an author. So all of a sudden, a few weeks after writing this book, I had probably the best agent I could have gotten in the space. I mean, and I tell people that now and they can't believe it. For me, I'm like, oh, okay, this is how it works. Apparently it doesn't always work that way. So I was very fortunate to get hooked up with Bill and Waterside Productions. And Waterside is also publishing my book, which I'm very happy about. They're super aligned and they understand the potential impact here. So that's the basic story of how the book came about. I definitely want to talk about the book, but I want to stop there in case you have any questions about my story or anything you want to dive into.
Nope. I'll just say that I love it. You remind me of my good friend Sean, who I asked you at the beginning because you're from San Fran if you're going to Burning Man. And my friend Sean is extremely smart, extremely smart. And he's a he's a banker. And he was so hard over there. Now we're good friends. And he always says, he's like, man, if you can get me, you can get anyone. And it feels like, you were so hard on that side and now coming over here. And that's good because it's bridging both sides. For me, I probably need to come more into your world and learn a little bit more of the hard science, a little bit more of the analytical, a little bit more of the process. And so I just love how you came over here because it's powerful when you have minds like that are looking at it brand new with such a strong skill set in evidence, in scientific study, in how to do like logical thinking and scientific process. So that's all I'll say. And please continue. Let us know where the research took you.
Sure. Well, I first want to say that what you just described, Matt, is the reason I'm doing this, is that I think I can reach people who were in my shoes 2 years ago and before, and also people who are in your shoes who have a knowing, but maybe I'm not sure what you've looked at, but maybe you haven't looked at quite as much evidence, or people that just want to have the backing so that when they have a conversation with someone, they can say, oh, this is what I think is real about reality, and this is why. And this gives them the ability. So I wrote it with that specific goal in mind. So in terms of the book itself, the book is called An End to Upside Down Thinking, Dispelling the Myth that the Brain Produces Consciousness and the Implications for Everyday Life. So the book looks at, what I have come to learn is the number 2 question remaining in all of science, according to Science Magazine. And that question, as they phrase it, is, what is the biological basis of consciousness? What does that mean in layman's terms? So for you and your listeners, Matt, if you can touch your arm, super easy, right? Touch your leg, makes sense. Touch your head, you can do that. If I ask you to touch your mind or touch your consciousness, can't do it. It's not physical. So this is precisely the problem that Science Magazine, and it's called the hard problem of consciousness. This is the problem. How is it that a physical body that you can touch, how does that physical body and a brain produce a non-physical mind or consciousness or an awareness? We don't know the answer. This is like the big open secret in all of science. We know how to send people to the moon and genetically modify biological systems, but we don't even know where our own mind comes from. So that, to me, that still blows me away, that this most fundamental part of our experience, our own awareness, has an unknown origin. Okay, so my book looks at this question and says, let's just first establish that we don't even know where it comes from. Beyond that, let's look at whether the brain produces consciousness. And what I would have told you 2 years ago is, well, someone gets in a car accident, they damage part of their brain, and then maybe they can't see very well, or they have mental problems after the accident. So obviously the brain produces consciousness, because look what happened to your brain and look what happened to your consciousness. So the error in that thinking, the thinking is, oh, well, the brain must cause and produce consciousness because the brain is related to consciousness. That is a fallacy In statistics, the fancy term is correlation does not imply causation. In layman's terms, an example that I reference in my book from a philosopher, Bernardo Castro. In Northern California, there were lots of fires last year. And when you had a large fire, there were lots of firefighters that came. We don't assume that the firefighters caused the fire just because they were there at the same time. That might be the exact same error that we're making with consciousness. There's a lot of activity in the brain, and we can sense a lot of conscious experience. The two things occur at the same time, but it doesn't always mean that one causes the other. What's an alternative? An alternative is, let's say the brain's like an antenna or a filter for consciousness, for some consciousness that's not localized or produced by the body. If that's true, then you could damage the brain, you could damage the antenna or the filter, and you'd get a messed up, if you're looking at your TV set, the show might be scratchy because you've screwed up the antenna. But it doesn't mean that the signal itself has been damaged or that the signal even comes from the TV. We know that the signal is picked up from outside the TV set, and that's a very rough analogy for what consciousness might be like. So the brain is sort of this processor for consciousness. That's where I've come out on it, that it's very much related to consciousness. And when I say consciousness, I mean I'm sitting here talking to you, Matt. What is the I that is having that experience? It's this kind of inner subjective experience. That's what I mean by consciousness. That is related to my brain, but what I'm saying is that it's not produced by the brain. And that is in some circles, massively controversial statement. In other circles, it's like, oh, obviously I knew that. It always depends on who I talk to. So that's the crux of what my book is looking at, that assumption. And to me, and I want to get into the implications later, that assumption is underlying so many problems in the world because it's leading to fear of death. It's leading to a sense of separation. And what I think all the evidence converges on is the idea that not only is consciousness not produced by the brain, that it exists beyond space and time, but that we're fundamentally connected as part of the same consciousness. So that has major implications for how we treat each other. And then on the biggest scales, things like interactions between nations and world peace, that's like way out there, but that's the implication. So that's the general premise of the book. And the book looks at the scientific evidence, which examines whether or not consciousness is produced by the brain. And what it challenges, there's a fancy term in philosophy, it's called materialism. And I was a materialist unknowingly, and I think a lot of the scientific community is, and a lot of the world is. Basically, what materialism says is the following, and this is exactly what I'm challenging with the book. It says there was a Big Bang 13.8 years ago. So that filled the universe with matter. When I say matter, I mean physical stuff. Like I'm touching my table, it's made of matter, atoms. When you have enough atoms, matter in the universe, just running around, interacting, you end up with a few of those atoms interacting with each other, and that's what's called chemistry, just the interaction of matter. And when you have enough random chemical interactions throughout this huge universe, you're bound to end up with a self-replicating molecule. Like probability would tell you that 1 in however many billions, you're going to end up with a structure that can replicate itself. That's something like DNA, the basis of our existence as biological beings. So DNA allows for the evolution of a living being like a human. The human being evolves to have a brain, and then magically consciousness pops out. So materialism says we start with a material universe made of matter, and we end up with consciousness. Matter creates consciousness. That's what materialism says. And that is what I'm saying is upside down. The upside down thinking is no, consciousness is primary, and matter is an experience within and created from consciousness. Okay? Any questions before I go on?
No, but I agree with that. I love it.
Okay.
And are you aware of, who's the Princeton Research Lab? They've been on the podcast a couple times, but they have a consciousness research institute there. And Adam Curry was on and was a part of that. And that's what his research was looking at. And I'm trying to remember the Godfather. He was on too. Shoot, I got to remember his name.
Robert John?
Nope. But I should get that guy on. No, that's good. That's a new name.
He recently passed away, but Roger Nelson, I'm going to guess?
Yes, Roger Nelson. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he's great. He's endorsing my book. He's been a very helpful.
Yeah,
process.
amazing. And I think, I want to just touch on one thing that I think is so important. It's not like the materialist view is wrong per se. It's a view and you can have it. But when you get to the root, and what you've done here is it brought it to the surface, is the implication or the assumptions that lead to fear of death and separation. And that, for me, when you break it all the way down to the very core, that creates all of the tertiary or other problems of the world, because we're afraid and then we think we're separate, so we need to protect. And so in this shift of worldview, it changes everything in how you experience life, and it is going to change within community and culture. Because if you realize that China is the same as you, and the Taliban are the same as you, and the person walking down the street that just looks a little bit different is the same as you, and you're not afraid, huge shift. So I think that where you came to the conclusion is the most important part. And so I'll let you continue on. But, I speak about that all the time, is like, they'll talk about new earth or 5D. And one of them is fear-based to love-based. If I don't have any fear that I just stop existing, then I can operate in a much different way. And I think that that's important.
Totally agree with you. So I'm on the same page. And I want to go back to your point about materialism, that there's a lot that we can still use from it. So the physical sciences, chemistry, biology, I'm not saying we should get rid of those. I'm arguing that we should recontextualize those as experiences within a broader consciousness, rather than being the producer of consciousness. So there's a lot we can still use scientifically from all this, but I think we could advance even further if we rethink about what consciousness is. So how do I arrive at this conclusion that consciousness isn't produced by the brain? We established before that there's no question that the brain has a relationship with consciousness, but is the brain producing it? So my book looks at various independent areas of scientific evidence, which to me argue that it's not produced by the brain. Consciousness isn't localized to the brain or dependent on it. And my reasoning is that if any of these phenomena are real, any of them, and it's like, I can't remember how many exactly, but there's 13 chapters in the book, and we go through different phenomena, and within each phenomena, we go through different pieces of evidence. If any of those are real, we can't explain it very well at all if the brain produces consciousness. But if the brain doesn't produce consciousness is beyond space and time, then these things are not even paranormal. They're actually what you would expect to be true. So we have these little anomalies popping up, and it's similar to around 1900, when people were saying, oh, we've discovered everything there is to discover in science except for a few rounding errors. And Lord Kelvin, who was one of the authorities, he said, well, we've discovered everything except for these two little clouds. And the clouds were these small anomalies that they couldn't figure out, but they had figured everything else out. Those anomalies turned into quantum mechanics and relativity theory. Those are two of the biggest theories in all physics that changed everything. And I think we have something very similar right now. We have these little anomalies that sometimes you only sense through statistics, and those could end up changing everything for us. And those are what I go through. So these are the different phenomena that I discuss chapter by chapter, in addition to talking about quantum physics and some of this general framework. The first section on phenomena is psychic abilities. And I'm talking about real psychic abilities, not like a machine that's artificial intelligence that can computationally come up with things. I'm talking about psychic. So I have a chapter on what's known as remote viewing, which is the ability to perceive something at a distance. So that means theoretically I could sit here, close my eyes, go into a trance, and tell you what's in some random location in Africa and draw it out. The US government ran a 25-year program on this. They released documents that were declassified within the last few years. They're in my book. They say remote viewing is real. So we can go into that later, but it's pretty explicit. I mean, I gave a talk, I was in Italy at the Science and Non-Duality Conference a few months ago, and people are very in tune with these things. And I put up those slides showing these are just from the government. I downloaded them at the CIA website, and they're in my book. And people were like, oh my goodness. Like, what do you do with that? Are they lying? Or did they make a mistake? That's just one piece of evidence. So remote viewing is one. Very well explained. If consciousness is everywhere, like, of course you would be able to access something distant. Telepathy. So that's like, I think of a friend, and then 5 minutes later they called me. It's like, oh, is that random? Or did I pick something up? I showed the evidence that that is not a random occurrence sometimes, and there are actually studies on that. Precognition. So that's a fancy word for saying knowing the future before it happens. And sometimes it's very explicit, like someone has a precognitive dream where they dream something and it's in detail, and then the next day or later in the future it happens. The more subtle version is the body responds very subtly seconds before some arousing picture is shown. And this has been done by multiple researchers where it's super subtle and you need statistics to look at it. But the body seems to know that something's coming before anyone knows. like a computer's randomly generating the picture. Not even the researcher knows what's going to happen. And the person's body's hooked up to a machine. I've actually done this at the Institute of Noetic Sciences because I wanted to see it myself. And the body responds a little bit before. And when it's an arousing picture versus a peaceful picture, for example, the body knows that something's going to come. And it's like, how does it do that? Well, if consciousness is not limited to the present, if it's beyond space and time, then it's like it's reaching into a future that is known to it beyond our, must be somehow in our subconscious. That is not well explained by the materialist view. I talk about animals and evidence that there are things animals can do that can be explained by these same types of abilities. And in the same way that we have a brain, animals have brains, whether they're different structures, but they still have brains. So does that mean they can do some of these things? I would argue that we need to be looking at it closely. And there's some emerging evidence that animals can do these things, like pets that know when their owners are coming home. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake has run studies on this, has done many replications where they have a camera on the dog, they have a camera on the owner who is sent to a random location miles away, not in her car at a random time. And the dog starts walking to the door when she decides, when she's told she's going home and is walking to her taxi. It's pretty wild. It's hard to explain other than fraud, which is a possible explanation for some of these studies. What I reason, though, is that you put all these together, the odds that they're all fraudulent or they're all bad statistics, I haven't seen evidence for that. So to believe that is almost like it's like a faith-based thing. Well, I just don't think I think it's just made up. So that's animals. Chapter on psychokinesis, and that's a fancy word for the idea that the mind can affect physical matter. So it's like the best case that's been studied the most at Princeton, it's called the random number generator. So this is a machine that spits out zeros and ones in a totally random fashion, sometimes by like radioactive decay. So no one's controlling it. We just know it's random. What do you expect? You expect 50% zeros, 50% ones over the long run. So what they did at Princeton and elsewhere, and Roger Nelson has been doing this, is they say, hey, I want you to put your mind to this machine. I want you to make it produce more ones and zeros. And you're like, well, that sounds crazy, but okay, I'll try to do it. What happens? You end up, in the long run, people end up having a very, very small but highly statistically significant effect on the machines, meaning that the machine starts to produce slightly more ones than zeros. And if you look at the odds that that's happening against just a chance occurrence, doing the math, it doesn't seem random. That's what the math is showing, and the odds that it's happening by chance are more than 1 in a billion. So these have been proven over and over again. And it's a subtle effect. And I've heard the argument of, well, why should we care if it's such a small effect? And I mean, my counter to that is, well, why does it matter what the size of the effect is? I mean, the Ebola virus is microscopic. Should we just not care about it because it's tiny? I mean, we know it can have a major effect on people. The same with bacteria or anything that's small but has a big effect. These are these little anomalies, these clouds that I was referencing that, like Lord Kelvin in 1900, these little clouds that we'll figure out. Well, we need to figure out how that someone's mind can affect the behavior of a physical process with no physical contact. I mean, that changes all of physics. So that's psychokinesis. Sorry, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, and I was just going to add that also with the random number generators, when there's a global event, so 9/11, and they've also actually tested it at Burning Man when everybody's looking at the man, the numbers go less random. So if everybody in the world is looking at the same event, it starts to become a little bit more cohesive, or it becomes not so random.
It's a great point. It's called the Global Consciousness Project, and Roger Nelson has left Princeton. He's now working on that full time. And what's crazy about that is these machines are set up all over the world, and they're behaving non-randomly when there's a major global event where there's some kind of emotional thing going on a global scale. But the thing is, people don't even know those machines are there. Most people don't even know, and the machines are still reacting. Whereas in some of the Princeton studies and others, it's more explicit of, hey, Matt, put your mind to this machine, even though you're far away, and they're still having an effect. So it shows that something about the coherence of emotion or intention is having an effect on the physical world. So this has major implications for how, like, what does group intention mean? If we all get together and think about the same thing, can we affect how the world works? Can we affect the collective consciousness? These are big questions that are being studied only by a minority of scientists. And that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, is we need to understand how this works much better. Because if that's really true, then what could we do to affect the world in a positive way? I think at the very least, what it's told me is like, look, we don't understand how all this works, but the way our mind is thinking and the intentions we're setting definitely have an impact. Or at the very least, it can't hurt to try to think positively, because there's something bigger happening beyond just a small change in a random number generator. And I do talk about some cases of energy healing where there are certain individuals who have these crazy abilities to like kill cells from far away. And these have been studied, and I talk about them in my book, by universities in the United States. They haven't been replicated many times, but people are looking at it. And there are cases around the world of miracle energy healers. It's the same principle of being able to focus intention. And sometimes the effect is really small, like it is for maybe an average person. And you have Michael Jordans of this, the people that are off the bell curve. They're the outliers that can do things really, really well. And that's one of the tricky things with this whole area of psychic abilities is I would argue that we all have them, even if they're subtle abilities. But then you have these all-stars, just like in basketball. You have Michael Jordan, you have LeBron James. They're the outliers that can do things amazingly well. They're super psychic, for example, if we're comparing to psychics. But then you have the general population they can dribble a ball, but they're not going to be in the NBA, for example. So that's something to keep in mind, and that's why maybe we see this difference. And also, we're not in a society that's harnessing these abilities. So let's say someone who is naturally talented for reasons we don't understand. Maybe their brain's configured in a certain way that allows them to receive the signal, if the brain's like an antenna, just naturally better, but they're not harnessing it. So it's hard to we have this now and then phenomenon for people who are amazing at it. And then the rest of us, maybe you can't tell unless it's a one-off occurrence, or you have to do the math, the statistics on it. So that's just something to keep in mind as we think about psychics. And I want to just clarify, I'm using the word psychic. That's a term that sometimes, like people, when I talk to them about psychics, they're like, well, are psychics real? Can they actually do things? I thought they were all fraudulent. I'm not arguing that every person that claims is a psychic is real and not fraudulent. I'm sure there are some out there, like in any industry, there are people that take advantage or just aren't that talented. But I would argue that there likely are some people with extraordinary abilities. And at the very least, I think the general population has these subtle abilities that we have an experience, like the Institute of Noetic Sciences, they'll call it a noetic experience, an inner knowing that will happen unpredictably or randomly, and that you can't always plan when it's going to happen. So that's the first half of the phenomena of the book. Anything you want to dive into there, Matt? Any phenomena?
Well, I was just gonna draw a bridge. Something came up for me where just I don't know if any of your studies have led to this, but just the power of belief. So everybody thought that the 4-minute mile was impossible, but once it was done, everybody started to break it. And so culturally, what we're looking at is like you brought up, well, like, hey, intelligence is memorizing facts, going through here, hard science, materialism, you got to see it, you got to prove it. And so that thought of psychic power, intuitive nature isn't present. So so culturally, we're not developing that skill that we may have. And the other thing that I'll just suggest is that if everybody gets out and they're dropped in the middle of a jungle or something's happened, their body is the intelligence. We don't know where it comes from, but if you take the consciousness out, I call that like my dum-dum brain, because it only, when I read a book on consciousness a long time ago, I don't know if the data still stands, but my consciousness can process 5 to 7 bits of information at once. So I can talk to you, I can kind of notice the fan in the background, I can grab my coffee if I want, but I can't process too much. But the unconscious can process thousands of bits. So if you and I are in the middle of like a fair and a bunch of lions come in, all of a sudden you and I are doing parkour moves that we couldn't even imagine, to us both hanging with like a 2-finger, proper rock climbing grip from something crazy to outrun this lion. That's the body's intelligence that's picking up all of these things that we're not even aware of. Say, get your butt out of there. And I don't think step here, move here. The body just does it. And then once I'm hanging and I'm kind of safe, then my consciousness, my limited brain, I won't call it the dum-dum, my limited consciousness of, Matt processing what the heck happened, comes in and is like, oh my goodness, I almost just get eaten by a lion. And so what we're doing is we're tapping into this bigger understanding. And that's what, if you look at Zen philosophies and things like that, they're seeing how they can bring their conscious awareness, that limited consciousness, into the expanded consciousness. And so I think just the only point that I wanted to make is that culturally, this belief of the 4-minute mile, we're not even having the discussion. It's like there's no value. And when I went through school, I was always curious, like something's missing, and we're not balancing the right and the left. And my friend Robert Grant, who is on the podcast, he's super brilliant. His company's on the New York Stock Exchange. He just made mathematical breakthroughs that got proven like a month ago and just broke math. Somehow you can Google him and check it out. But he presented this in Egypt. I didn't know what he said. I did his course. I still don't know what he said. So someone like you might be able to help me like quantify that. But when I asked him about sport, I was like, hey, Robert, how could I use this math for sport? He's just like, for me, it's both sides of the brain. I do art and I do the math because they're polar opposites. And what you're doing is you're getting the brain, the two hemispheres, to connect together. So we need both sides. We just haven't placed any value on that, the unknown. And when you really step into the unknown and you have that experience, that non-local mind, and it's direct, instantly that you don't know what reality is. You know, because you're in this space of consciousness that just breaks all that, and then you come back down. So I just want to add that and go back to you. I don't know, and you can keep going. I think you have a line of thought here, but I'm curious also just some of the best science, like some of the best studies that if you are logical, you're going to look at those and really come to a place where you got to think about it.
I agree with all that, Matt. I think it relates to some research on meditation, which is the quieting of the left brain effectively, which is the logical side of the brain. And there's evidence that people who are regular meditators are better able to do these psychic functionings. So Dean Radin is someone who's looked at this in his book, Supernormal. Dean's one of the world leaders on this, and he's been great with me in this book, and he's endorsed it and has given great suggestions throughout. So I recommend Dean Radin to everybody. He's looked at meditation. And his book Supernormal talks about yoga and these practices that quiet the mind, quiet the logical brain, that allow us then potentially to access this non-local mind, this intelligence or knowing that we can't rationally think about. It's like, well, how did you come up with that? How did you come up with that solution? It just came to me, and we can't break it down. It's this kind of inner knowing that I think we're trained not to trust as much. We're trained to, like in finance for me, we need to make a business decision. Okay, run a financial model, come up with the discounted cash flow analysis, and then compare the two numbers, and that's your decision. That's it. And there's a place for that for sure. But then there's also this, well, I think this decision's better. I can't really tell you every reason why, but I just know it's better. And that's this right brain versus left brain thing. And I think it needs to be explored more. And that's another reason I wrote this is if we think of the brain very differently as a receiver or a transceiver of consciousness, then we need to understand how that receiver works to better understand how to optimize our own performance and our intuition and our just everything that we do. So I'm hoping that people will rethink the brain and then potentially just uncover new things. Along those lines, I want to go back to telepathy because I kind of glossed over that. And one of the key studies is there. And this is something Dean Radin and others have looked at very closely. It's called the Ganzfeld Procedure. And this is another one where you have to do statistics, but to me, it's really powerful because it's been replicated so many times. The basic design is I'm sitting in a room with headphones on, put in a very relaxed state. It's called the Ganzfeld state, where basically I'm almost in a trance. They send Matt into another room and they say, hey, Matt, I'm going to show you this picture, and I want you to send an image of that picture to Mark. I know it sounds crazy. You're in a separate room. He doesn't even know what you're looking at. I want you to send it to him while he's relaxed. I come out of my state after you've been sending it to me mentally, and I'm shown 4 pictures, and I'm asked to choose which one Matt was sending to me from this other room from a distant place. And I'm like, I don't know, this one. And you would expect that I would be correct 1 out of 4 times because it's totally random, right? 25%. What do researchers find with everyday people? These are not psychically trained people, is that they're correct about 32% of the time. Now, if you do statistics on this, it's massively significant. Like that's not a chance occurrence that 32% versus 25. And it actually makes a lot of sense because if we were 100% telepathic all the time, then we'd know each other's thoughts. But we know that's not the case all the time. Instead, it's subtle. It's like I'm thinking about this person and then they text me. It's this subtle where some information is getting through. So to me, that is just a majorly significant finding that has been replicated enough times, and they've aggregated the results from different studies. And when you put it together, you continue to get close to 32%, which is not a chance occurrence. So this, again, is some of the science that I referenced that to me is very strong. And people who have actually taken the time to look at it can't explain it through regular, normal means. And that actually brings me to another point, which we'll probably talk about later, is, well, okay, Mark, if all these findings are out here, these random number generators at Princeton, this Ganzfeld study across where people have looked at this across the world, why is no one talking about it? Shouldn't it be obvious? Shouldn't it be taught? Like, why wasn't I taught it so when I studied psychology? I think we have a very similar situation to what Galileo faced a long time ago, a few hundred years ago, when he looked in his telescope and saw, wait a second, just because the sun is moving across the sky doesn't mean that the sun is revolving around us. It's actually the reverse, that we're revolving around the sun, which is at the center. At his time, that was a very controversial statement to be making. And certain clergymen wouldn't look in his telescope to see the evidence because it challenged the prevailing belief systems and would have meant that people had to rethink things. And I think we have something very similar right now. And I show this in the book of, I think there are some very smart scientists who, if they looked at the evidence and actually looked at it with an open mind, might be exploring these issues a lot more. And I think we need that to advance scientifically, but also for all the reasons you mentioned in terms of existentially and thinking about the lack of separation that actually exists. So that's one of the key things that I noticed throughout the research, is that very smart scientists have not looked at this closely. Or maybe they looked at one study that didn't match their standards and that's it. And they're busy with other things and they don't want to look at things that they don't think can be real. So that's a really important point. Okay, so we just went through a major section of the book, different phenomena that people will call psychic, or psi, PSI is a word that scientists use. Then I have another section on the evidence that consciousness survives when the brain and body die, that consciousness exists actually independently. Again, if that's true, then this notion that consciousness is independent of the brain, that it's not produced by the brain, that would line up. So I have a chapter on near-death experiences. And to me, this is one of the crazier areas. And I actually have my own podcast coming out, Matt, in the fall. I've interviewed over 40 people in this space. So a lot of the scientists and practitioners in my book, I've interviewed, and we'll be releasing them. I think people really like to hear the voices of these people. But the near-death experience, if you had asked me 2 years ago, I would have said, well, I haven't heard much about it, but I know people, they see a light, and when their brain is about to shut off, it releases chemicals that makes people hallucinate. That's what I would have said, and I think that's the conventional wisdom on the near-death experience. What I realized through the research and talking to scientists myself is that these experiences are occurring in some cases where there's zero brain function. So these are people in cardiac arrest, and it's known during cardiac arrest that it's known as a flat EEG, meaning there's no electrical activity in the brain, and people are having memories during that period when there's no activity in the brain. So that is extremely difficult to explain by conventional means, because you'd expect that you need a conscious, active brain to have all this stuff happening. But I should take a step back. What's happening? What are these memories people are reporting? And this is really important, because if we take these things literally as being descriptions of reality, then it's world changing. And so a few people who have read, so my book comes out in October, a few people who have read it, early readers and some endorsers, have said that the near-death experience to them, that's like one of the most world changing for people who haven't been exposed to it. So across cultures, back from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, people describe these things. But it was only more commonly discussed around 1975. Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life, profiled the near-death experience. And it's because resuscitation technology has gotten so much better. Meaning we have an ability now to basically bring people back from the dead, whereas before we just didn't have that technology. So now the reports are like in the millions of people who have some variation of these experiences. And now scientists can study them under different conditions. What people report is like they see a white light. Sometimes they describe hovering over their body. And in the craziest cases, they describe things accurately that happened in the room while they're hovering over their body. And this, in some cases, is happening when there's no brain function. So it's called a veridical out-of-body experience. Veridical meaning it's verified by people who were not dead at the time afterwards. So they come back in their body and they're like, oh yeah, you were the surgeon doing these things. And it's like, well, how did you know that? Because they were still conscious. Their consciousness apparently wasn't dependent on their brain. Then they this is actually one of the most important insights that I've gotten, is that people report a life review. It's where their life flashes before them, like their entire life, and they're judging themselves for how they acted. But this is the kicker. In some cases, they report experiencing their life through the eyes of those they affected. So if they inflicted pain or harm on someone, they feel that pain through that person's eyes. And they're judging themselves for how they acted. It's like, I should have known better. I shouldn't have acted that way. So if we take that as a literal description of what the meaning of life is, just as a little snippet, then it suggests that we need to be acting well, because that's what we, or consciousness, wants. And it also suggests that we have this universal consciousness, because how are people with no brain functioning at all, or minimal brain functioning at the very most, are able to switch back and forth between perspectives? Like, how can I take the perspective of some person that I affected? If consciousness is everywhere, then that totally makes sense. It's just like you're switching perspectives because you're able to do it in this other form. But that's a really key insight that I always think about. And when I talk to people about it, it is a world-changing finding, because it suggests over and over again, when I talk to people who have these experiences, or the scientists, that it's not about how much money you made in your life. That's not what you're going to be thinking about during this life review that everyone's reporting. It's, how did you treat yourself and others? How did you treat the cashier at the grocery store? Those are the things you're judging yourself for, more so than did you make $1 billion and have a huge mansion. So it's a really important insight that comes out of the near-death experience. And then sometimes people report seeing deceased relatives, and in some cases they'll see a deceased relative who they didn't know was deceased yet, and then they find out later was deceased. So it's another verifiable thing. They come back in their body because they talk to some being of light, and that they just say, well, you need to go back. There's more for you to do. They come back in their body and they're forever changed. They don't fear death as much in some cases. Sometimes electrical equipment doesn't work around them. So I've talked to researchers on this who, Dr. Jan Holden is one, and she talks about at it's the Association for Near-Death Experiences. It actually exists. They have a conference. And she says, you can always tell who's had a near-death experience and who hasn't. Because the people who have had the near-death experience, they're not wearing watches, because watches don't work around them. And electrical things break down. And I've heard that from different psychics. I have no idea why. But it's like people have these changes, not only apparently physical, but also just in terms of how they look at life. And there are many times their life preferences change. They don't care about their job as much. Divorces are reported because it's like all of a sudden they come back and they have a totally different perspective on how things work. So there's a whole chapter on that and the science behind it. In some cases, this is another one that's crazy. People who have been blind since birth report being able to see during the near-death experience. And then they come back in their body and they can't see anymore. I mean, how do you explain that if our senses and if our consciousness is dependent on our brain? But if it's not, again, it's not a paranormal thing. It's like, okay, well, the brain is a limiter of our consciousness, and maybe our organs were limiting this broader knowing, as the researchers call it, a transcendental awareness that we have. So when a blind person or some person who's colorblind, that's happened as well, they're able to see things they can't normally see during the near-death experience. It's like their brain's filter has been unlocked, and they have this broader awareness that's always been there, but it's typically limited. There's also something known as the shared death experience, which is where a healthy bystander is sitting by the bedside of someone dying and has a near-death experience with the person who's dying. Sometimes they co-live the life review of the person who's dying. Totally nuts. I mean, so they come back and this goes against the argument that the near-death experience is caused by a hallucination of a dying brain. Because the person who has the shared death experience doesn't have dying brain. They're a normal person at the bedside. They're not even sick, and they're having the experience. So how do you explain that? I don't know. They're making it up. I think there's enough of these cases where it's very hard to explain as some kind of made up thing or fraud. So that's the near-death experience. I think it's a really important phenomenon that should be taught more regularly. We should learn from it and study. It doesn't always happen to people. So even they're known as prospective cardiac arrest studies. These are studies where cardiologists or medical professionals are talking to people right after they come out of cardiac arrest. In some cases, the person dies, but in other cases, they come back to life. And you would expect in cardiac arrest, it is so traumatic physiologically to go through that. Brain's off, heart is not functioning, they're clinically dead. A percentage of those people after cardiac arrest describe this near-death experience. So Dr. Pim van Lommel, who is a cardiologist in Netherlands, he's looked at this extensively, and he had an article published in The Lancet, which is a very prominent medical journal, talking about what he found, that a percentage of people, somewhere between 10 and 20%, depending on the study size, they're reporting this near-death experience right after cardiac arrest. Very hard to explain. Why is it that some people have it and others don't? We don't know. But there should be 0% of people having this experience, and it's not zero. Again, it's an anomaly that we can't explain. Anything there, Matt, you want to touch on?
Oh, man. Yeah, man. There's like so much. I'll begin with, I think, the important idea of when you said the life review, and I've heard that as well. And so you die, and what happens is you see how you affected others. And that when we're in this physical reality, we're kind of trained for competition. Get what I can. If you're not on the ball, then somebody's going to take your money and whatever baloney, right? That's how we're conditioned. And I am of that idea too, that, you know, what as I move around, I know that I affect others, but I think that in the life review, people sometimes think God will come down and he'll judge you, or you just die and you go into the dirt, and then, you know, you don't have to be responsible for what you've done. And I don't think that it's anything outside of you that holds you responsible. I think it's you. I think it's a mirror that comes up and you review you. So you have no exit. You have no exit from what you've done, because you're looking at it and you're like, oh crap, that was me. It's not anyone else judging me. I'm judging me because I can feel what I have done to others. And then you start to look into the mind and you're trying to find reason for your actions. You're seeing if you can make sense within yourself that was this reasoning of survival, right? That's what, in fear, you're in survival mode. You know, and so I think culturally have this, you know, just like I said, competition mode, get what you can, survive, you know, push a man down rather than helping him up. And if we can just come to that little tiny idea that we affect our reality, it's super powerful. And, you know, you're getting dangerously close to the meaning of life. And so when we go around, just like, and you're in your deathbed, and then you're like, oh yeah, I acquired all this material stuff. That's great. You can maybe want a house for your kids. You want to have a car so you can get around. That's all well and good. But when that's your main driving force, you're going to realize at some point that was empty. There's no fulfillment there. And I had Frank Ostaseski on the podcast a while ago, and he wrote a book called The 5 Invitations, What Death Can Teach Us About Fully Living. And he's a co-founder of Zen Hospice. So he helped hundreds of thousands, well, thousands of people go into the process and talk to them as they, you know, as they were processing their death and what was most important. So when you realize that, number one, that, you know, you're going to have to face your own actions, and you know this, you know, and you can even just present it as an idea. You don't have to believe it, but, you know, you affect people, and you're going to have to be responsible for that in some way within yourself, not someone else. 2, you could die at any moment. You can die whenever, you know, you don't get 100 years promised. Then you can start living from a little bit of a different view, you know, and a more fulfilling view. So you take a life review. So there's 2 processes that usually when I do coaching with people, I start them through right away. Originally, I would use a shamanic death ritual, which is basically just a hypnotic death process. So it's like, okay, here we go. And we relax you, right? And then I go, bam, you know, and I'm like, hey, now you're dead. Let's do a life review. And people would just process, why did I care so much about this? Why did I care so much about that? And in the hypnotic process, all it is I just relax your mind. So if you're thinking about Cheetos and picking up the kids and doing whatever task list you got to do, you can't really get into the imagination of what it would be like if you died. But the other one that I do, because I feel like it's a little bit more powerful now, is like a heart hypnosis. So I hypnotize you into your heart, and then I let your heart ask certain questions to yourself. Okay, you're human, you're here. What's most important? Not out of the head and fear-based, but into heart-based, where you know you're eternal. You keep living, that you affect every single thing, that you're connected to everything. You know, what is meaningful to you? And that's what you're getting to, like step by step. It's uncovering possibility. I think that's what we're doing here with this awakening of consciousness, is we're kind of like I say dolphins, you know what I mean? But we've conditioned to think that we're goldfish. And one by one, these limiting factors or these valves are opening up, and we're starting to regain our abilities, realizing that we can send a signal to our other dolphin friend and they can send one back, that we can actually jump out of the water, that we can use our collective consciousness and hunt together so that food is easy, and that we don't have to support or push anyone down, that we can actually collaborate and have a much better life experience. So that's my rant, and you just keep going with whatever you want.
I love it. I agree with you. And I love the point you made about it's you judging yourself. So what I think the evidence points towards is a universal consciousness of which we are a part, which implies that there's no separation, that the judger is the judged. This is a very non-dual thing to say, and that's kind of where I come out on things, that there is no duality of some third party judging us. So that's a really important point, because that's how I used to think about when people talked about like divinity, that there's me and then there's this separate immortality force out there. What this is suggesting to me is that those are one and the same, just the appearance of separation. That's a really key point, I think. And that's what's suggested by it, because if I'm able to go through the eyes of someone else to experience feelings, it's the same consciousness. That's the only explanation I can think of. It's a universal consciousness having different lenses through which it has an experience. So that's an important point. But I agree with you, Matt, to hone in on the life review, because it is getting close to the meaning of life. And for me, I'm not sure if we can fully ever comprehend it with our limited brain when we get into logical mode, but that's one little nugget to me that stands out, because it has such a profound impact on people. And for me to have interviewed people on my podcast who've had these experiences, how much it's changed them. I mean, they come back totally transformed. So one is Dr. Alan Hyuga, who's a hardcore scientist himself, had a near-death experience before it was okay to talk about them, like around 1970. And he was cradled by a being of light while being in an accident. And he was like, I don't want to go back into my body. And they said, you need to come, there's more you need to do. But it totally changed how he thinks about things. He doesn't fear death at all. He says he fears pain. And I've heard this from people, they fear suffering. But the actual act of death to them is viewed as a transition of consciousness rather than something negative. And actually the experience that people have is this one of, they feel unconditional love. That's what they always talk about. It's this blissful sensation. I mean, Dr. Eben Alexander is another great example. He wrote Proof of Heaven. He's a former Harvard neurosurgeon. He's been so kind to endorse my book. And in my interview with him, it was just so evident how life transformative it was for him as a former materialist and a hardcore scientist at Harvard to go through this experience that was so undeniable, and then to come back. And he was in a hardcore coma for a week. And I talked to professors at University of Virginia who are examining the medical records, and they show that he was as close to death as possible and was having these highly lucid experiences that have taught him about what reality is. So I guess the overarching point I want to make with near-death experiences is that we could regard them as somehow a hallucination caused by a brain, in which case it's not real. Alternatively, we could regard them as a window into the actual reality that we're clouded from on a normal basis. And if that's true, then we need to be looking at this very carefully to see what the commonalities are, what the differences are, and why, because it might teach us about the actual nature of reality that we're in. So I think that's huge. And there are other things that teach us about that, like psychedelics. And I talk about psychedelics in my book and some of the studies that have come out on that. In some cases, psychedelics reduce brain functioning. So there's a study in 2012 on psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. What you would expect is when someone's tripping, they're having this ultra real reality, that there would be more brain functioning. If the brain produces consciousness, you might expect more brain activity with enriched experience. What do you find? You find reduced brain activity and an enriched experience. What do you find in the near-death experience? Reduced or no brain functioning and a heightened experience. There are a number of cases like this: reduced brain functioning, more consciousness. That aligns with the idea that the brain is like a filter. And these experiences sort of unlock the filter that's normally clouded out by all the activity in our brain. So that's a near-death experience. That's chapter 9 in my book. I think it's a really important one because it gets into what reality is. I have a chapter on after-death communications and communications with the deceased. There are case studies back to the 1800s of people. One is Mrs. Piper, who Harvard professor William James studied her, and they sent her to England. She was from the US to run seances, talking to dead people. They had detectives follow her around to make sure she wasn't talking to anybody, and she was able to get information that people report. So she was one of these Michael Jordans. And there are a few throughout the ages that people have reported. And those are anecdotal cases. And sometimes people say, well, it's an anecdote and there are a million reasons it could have been made up. They couldn't really talk to dead people. Recently, there have been some controlled studies conducted. Dr. Julie Beischel at the Windbridge Research Center is running the studies. She was a pharmacology PhD and had an experience with a medium after her mother died. A medium is someone who claims to be able to talk to dead people, psychic medium. Which again, if consciousness isn't limited to the brain, then that's not a paranormal thing at all. Then when someone dies, their consciousness is just out there, theoretically. So she's studying this in a controlled manner to take away any anecdotal issues of her studies are 5-way blinded. So she's on the phone with the medium. She gives the first name of the deceased person, and the medium then gives information. And then there's an independent rating process rating the answers. And what do they find in 2 peer-reviewed journal studies? That these mediums are able to get non-chance information that they shouldn't know about dead people just from getting the first name. So again, these need to be replicated more, but it all aligns. It aligns with everything else we've talked about. So that's an important area. There's another area that's related, which is an after-death communication, where it's not like in a lab like this, where you're talking to a medium over the phone. It's where an everyday person is having alleged communications with a deceased person, where they come to them in a dream, or there's a case I talk about, Paul Davids, who was a Princeton psychology grad. So I'm like, okay, I know what your upbringing is because we had the same training. And he's a Hollywood producer. He wrote a book called An Atheist in Heaven, where he chronicles over 150 cases, I think, where his deceased colleague was communicating with him, including an ink blot where he left the room and he was in a house by himself and there was an ink blot covering certain words that had meaning. And he sent it to a lab for 3 years, like the best chemists in the world. He wanted to figure out what was going on. They couldn't figure out the composition of what the ink blot was. And he chronicles many cases like this. So there are these anecdotes that many of your listeners might be able to relate to, where someone deceased, they feel their presence. It's harder to prove, but there are some cases where it's very hard to explain. And I go through some of those. The next chapter is on children who have memories of a previous life. So these were done, excuse me, at the University of Virginia over 50 years. Dr. Ian Stevenson, who was a prominent psychiatrist at UVA, was running these studies. And now Dr. Jim Tucker, who I interviewed on my podcast as well, running these studies. These are very difficult to explain by conventional means. Over 2,500 children around the world, they are describing memories of a life that's not theirs in vivid detail in some cases. Often they're describing how they died. These children are between the ages of 2 and 5 years old and are talking about things that they shouldn't know about. And in some cases, they have preferences, like they want tobacco or alcohol, like things that don't make sense for a little kid. In some cases, the families have never talked about these things. So it's like preferences are being transferred. And the most compelling cases to me are where children have birthmarks or physical deformities that match how they describe dying in the previous life. Where in some cases, the researchers from UVA find medical records that match how the child described dying and match the birth defects. So in one case in the book, I was able to use a picture from Dr. Ian Stevenson's book of a little girl who described having a very brutal death where she was tied up in ropes and she was tortured and died in a past life. And she says, Grandpa, why did they torture me? Dr. Stevenson shows a picture of this little girl's leg, and you can see constriction rings, like her leg is this and then goes in and then out as if it were tied in ropes. And that's the natural shape of the leg in the picture. So, and then they found a person who died in the exact way that that little girl described. So, I mean, how do we explain that? I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to explain that. And there are other cases like it. There are enough where the children either know so many things that they couldn't have known otherwise, or they had these distinctive birthmarks and deformities that have been studied carefully by scientists that I personally respect and have gotten to talk to. I have a hard time explaining that through anything conventional, other than I just don't want to believe it. I think that's maybe the best explanation. So that's an interesting one, because that starts to get into this concept of reincarnation. Is it another form of consciousness that's re-inhabiting another body, or is it a psychic ability of they're psychically tapping into some deceased person and they're inhabiting those memories somehow, and then somehow that's affecting their physical form? I don't know. I'm most compelled by this notion of reincarnation, which is sort of a misnomer, because I regard time as not existing at all. And I get into this in the book. And if there's no time, then the idea that you were something and then are something else is kind of a human construct. So it's sort of more like consciousness is just having all these experiences. But anyway, it gets into topics that I would have never looked at before. So those are the different phenomena that I talk about in detail in the book, and cite all the evidence for people who want to look into it. I try to simplify things as much as possible because it can get complex. I have a chapter on quantum physics as well to simplify things for people. And I conclude that, look, I went through all these different phenomena. I don't think it's reasonable to say that all these things are made up, that it's just someone lying, that it's all bad statistics, that it's just delusion. I think that there's a high probability that at least one of the things that I talk about in the book is real. And if at least one is real, I think it's probably a lot more than one. But if at least one is real, then we need to account for it. And I don't think materialism, matter through a brain creates consciousness, I don't think that can explain it. I think we need a new framework where consciousness is the basis of reality. And that would explain things very, very well.
I love it, man. Well, I appreciate you doing all that research, because it's definitely the way that I've kind of had my own worldview as I imagine it. And the first and like most fundamental thing I can think about is just your own coherence through your own consciousness and your own body as you navigate life. And so when we're talking about consciousness, most people believe consciousness is, I've been calling it taskless consciousness right now, or fear-based consciousness. You wake up and you go through your task list, you go to your job, maybe you get to go to the pub with your buddies. If you're a girl, I don't know what they do whatever they do, but I'm just thinking about it as like a Canadian boy with my homies. And that's basically how people operate, taskless consciousness, and they think that's everything. But when you go into deep states of meditation, you have these experiences of, some people call it non-local mind or whatever, but people operate from this one piece of consciousness that is the most limited piece of consciousness. The most limited consciousness you could perceive is the one that makes sure you don't get hit by a car. And when you can expand that into different experiences, you realize how massive consciousness really is, like what it actually is. And it's that fear of getting hit by a car or not having enough food or whatever in this let's say limited perspective that has you do things over and over and over that you might not want to do. So one of the things I kind of say sometimes is that if you wake up and you go to a space like a cubicle or a job or wherever that you don't want to go to 5 days a week, 40 hours, you're a slave, because that's what slavery is. You go to a space you don't want to go to. That's what slavery is. And not only do we have mental slavery, we have physical slavery, because we're in this taskless, limited consciousness where we have to go to this job to go get coupons so we're allowed to buy food and we can be indoors. But when you realize how actually powerful that you are, when you make that own choice within yourself to design your reality from your own making, from your own values, and begin to trust this higher force, you can still you'll still get food and you'll still be indoors, but you'll go to spaces that you prefer. It takes a little bit of time, but you get there. But what happens is you bring the meaning back to what you decide the meaning is, not what somebody else decided the meaning was or what was real for them. And so it's a really powerful shift. And then the one thing I wanted to touch on before is like community and tribal. When you realize, like, if we weren't so big and we had small communities of 10 people, 50 people, 100 people, and you knew everybody, if you were going around town being a total a-hole, everybody would know who you were. And they'd be like, yo, man, let's get the community together and be like, why do you keep going and being such an a-hole to everybody? Can you please stop that? And we are a tribal species. We're the human species. I like to say Team Earth. What would happen if USA teamed up with Canada, teamed up with Russia and Sweden and Korea, and all the scientists started, everybody doing anything got out of fear-based and just like, here's everything. I hope that your life is better. There is no competition. This might be able to help you. And we can do extraordinary things from that perspective, but ultimately you are the only one that can change your consciousness and reality. And that comes from that reflection. But you've got to learn, I think one of the first and most important steps is getting out of that taskless consciousness. If this is a stretch for you, it's because you only operate in taskless consciousness. You don't know how to meditate. And you could do it in other ways, but you've got to learn how to quiet the mind, because the mind has to solve the problems. You know, you have to basically be able to imagine the house in the existence that you want from heart center, from expansive mind, and then you use taskless consciousness to go get the materials to build the life you want. That's what it's for, not the other way around. The heart steers and leads, and the hands and the other consciousness make sure you avoid the little pitfalls, do the organization, set up the meeting, and do all that kind of do, and you have this balanced perspective. But we're so far in one way. So I'll leave it at that, and just want to give it back to you, and you can add on. But I want to see where you came for these implications, because you talked about that a little bit. You talk about there's a question about Elon Musk and Neuralink, because I haven't heard about that.
Okay.
You know, what do you feel are the implications of having a look at this, and really all I suggest to people at the end of the day is that you really got to process what is important to you. Are you living your life values? Are you happy? You know, give yourself, when I train with the Shaolin monks, you know, and I've been in this research too, who's doing the most incredible stuff? The Shaolin monks could break stone with 2 fingers. And so I interview him, and I'm trying to figure out how that's possible. And he starts slamming his fingers down on the desk, and there's dent holes in the trees outside the academy. And he had did hard qigong with his fingers for years, I think 5-6 years, something like that. And qigong using energy for years to be able to do something we believe is so out there. So if you can think of an idea of your life experience, you know, if you look at a 10-year-old, you say you can do anything in the world, right? And then 20 hits and 30 hits, and they throw you through education. It's like, this is important. And if you do this, you can get a Mercedes and a cool house, right? But what about the person traveling the world to all these different experiences? What about the musician who really wanted to explore art? What about, I don't know, living on the beach and surfing? What is the thing that calls to you the most? And then when you die, are you doing the thing that you decided to do or someone else told you? And you need to learn how to quiet the mind and go within. What are my values? What do I want to imagine here? What could I build over a lifetime? Who am I, and what signature do I want to live? What do I want to build over 10 years? You know, and usually that's not someone else's idea.
I love it, Matt. I like the way you think.
Cool.
Very aligned with you. So in terms of implications, I mean, I think you hit on a lot of the things about how we live our day-to-day lives. I break it down into different categories. So the last 2 chapters of the book are in a question-answer form. I took questions that I think people would ask, or questions that people have asked me, and then I answer them. So that's the last 2 chapters. Elon Musk's startup, Neuralink, which is all about creating a wizard hat for the brain, basically using electronics to enhance the brain. And the argument I make is, well, there's not much known about what he's doing, but it sounds like they're using this materialist perspective that the brain is the producer of consciousness. And if that's the case, I think they're probably limited in how they're thinking about the brain and their product. If instead they studied the brain as being more like a limiter or a filter or an antenna of consciousness, could they enhance psychic abilities using this machinery? So I raised those questions of, and that's kind of in the first section of that chapter, of how can we enhance abilities to improve our lives in different ways, in business or in otherwise. If we have psychic abilities, can we use them? Can we meditate better and do things like the monks can do? Or can we build machinery that can enhance these things? It gets into a topic also on artificial intelligence, which is a hot topic right now. I think about artificial intelligence very differently, because if matter doesn't create consciousness, then can we create sentient artificial intelligence? Can we create a machine that has feelings, basically, that wants power? I would argue that until we understand how consciousness is interacting with the brain and inhabiting this physical form, I'm not worried about it. I think there are still dangers. Like, you could create a machine that says, kill a person that looks like this, and that would be horrible. And it could do that, but it's still just mechanistic. It's just computationally doing what it's told to do, whatever the operator tells it. It's not sentient on its own. It's not having emotions. So I'm not sure we can create artificial intelligence that can be emotional and want power in the way that some people are fearing. So I'm not saying we should totally forget about artificial intelligence as being a danger, but I think maybe some of the fears are overblown, because some people are making this assumption about consciousness that, oh yeah, well, we can just create consciousness from a machine. And shows like Westworld kind of had that implicit idea of, well, when they get complex enough, then consciousness somehow emerges. That is the magical step that no one knows how it even happens. And I'm arguing it doesn't happen, that matter doesn't create it. So that's a big one. Artificial intelligence is a hot topic. I think for medicine, I mean, this is totally game changing for medicine, because medicine and most of the scientific community are regarding consciousness as it's known as an epiphenomenon of brain activity, meaning it just pops out of the brain. And as an epiphenomenon, it pops out and has no effect on the world around it. If that's true, then this whole like mind-body thing doesn't make any sense. But if consciousness is having some effect on the physical form, it certainly does on random number generators. And I talk about metal bending and some other, crazier things where it's more substantial. Then how can our mind impact our body? Again, this is one of those things where at the very least, it seems to me to make sense and a low risk thing to think positively and to try to have healing thoughts towards our body, because I don't think it can hurt. And in the best case scenario, it probably can help. If we go back to the children who remember previous lives, somehow their physical form is affected by consciousness. And it has nothing to do with genetics or environment, which are the two things that are believed in mainstream science to affect physical form. It's your genes or it's your environmental factors. This is something totally separate. And the researchers at University of Virginia, they call it the third factor. If there's a third factor that affects our physical body, I mean, we need to account for that. That is immense. That changes all of medicine. So, I mean, I talk about this in a page or something when I say, what are the implications for medicine? I mean, there could be books written on each of these individual sections, but that's a huge thing for medicine. We need to be able to account for those anomalies. And then once we account for it, understand how we can treat people differently, medically. And then I think it gets into more existential topics where I spend most of my time thinking now, because I've read enough of the science where to me, these things are not outrageous. When I tell certain people about them, maybe some of your listeners are hearing these things for the first time, it's totally jaw dropping. It's like, how do I even think about these things? I don't even know I need some time like by myself. And that's what happened to me. Now for me, it's like, I think about it so often that the implications are where my head is. And it gets to things like meaning of life. So we talked about the life review. It seems like at the very least, part of the meaning of life is to treat others well, and for like consciousness to treat itself in a positive way, and to experience this unconditional love that is talked about all the time, but which we don't necessarily experience on a day-to-day basis. I think that's definitely part of the meaning. There's a notion of the evolution of consciousness. I touch on it very briefly in the book. In my podcast, it comes up more with people who are channeling. And channeling is where a form of consciousness like comes through a person and in some cases overtakes the person and they're speaking in a different tongue almost. And this happens to some children who remember previous lives. It's known as xenoglossy with an X, where a person speaks a language they were never taught. How was a little kid? There aren't many cases, but there are a few that these researchers have found where the kids are speaking languages they weren't taught. So my point here on channeling is one of the messages that comes across a lot. This is extremely anecdotal, but it's the notion that consciousness is trying to evolve itself. And it's like a constant growth process. And each of these physical forms, Mark, Matt, each of the listeners are experiencing different physical forms. So it's like consciousness having a diversity of experiences, but moving towards this goal of becoming more loving or treating people well, treating people like ourselves, because if we're the same consciousness, they really are just you. So that's a big topic. If that's like kind of the meaning of life, that we're trying to evolve consciousness, that changes, I think, how one might live. How can I personally evolve my consciousness? How can I treat other people better on a day-to-day basis? How can my work, even though we need to live and we need to make enough money to live in a house or an apartment and get food, how can we do that in a way that's benefiting other people? Because if that's really the goal here, for all of us to treat ourselves as the same consciousness, no matter how we look or think, that has big implications. So to me, it seems like there's something there to this evolution of consciousness, and I want to research it more. But the people who are channeling, it comes through across so many different channelers and across decades. If you read channeled text of people they go into this mode where they're just writing and it's not really them. This notion of the evolution of consciousness comes up over and over again. So that undercuts so much of what we're taught as being meaningful. It's incredible. So I think meaning of life that's an important topic. Happiness, that's a big one. I think why are most of us doing the things we do? I think we're trying to be happy or avoid suffering, and they're to me one and the same. if we think of the natural state of consciousness that we see in near-death experiences and some psychedelic users of that's happiness. It's like it's there the whole time, but our brain and our everyday life are filtering these things out. Then it suggests to me that happiness is not something external. And this would explain why you have some famous people who are, we're seeing it now, committing suicide or very unhappy. It's tragic. And you would think based on materialism that, well, you should just collect as much material stuff as you can because you're going to be dead soon and that's all that matters. And we're all separate. Then material things should bring happiness, but we don't see that. And from my own personal experience, I mean, I achieved a lot of things that I wanted, and then I would just return to baseline. And I was looking for the next thing. In psychology, they call it the Hedonic Treadmill. It's like you're on a treadmill running for the next thing. You get it, but you haven't moved anywhere. And then you're on to the next thing, still running. I think many people can relate to that on all levels of you have a goal, you get it, and you're not, maybe you're happy for a short period of time, but it doesn't bring lasting happiness and lasting peace. I was just talking to Rupert Spira about that. He, to me, is one of the greatest living non-dual philosophers. He's based out of the UK, and I was asking him what drew him to non-duality, this idea that consciousness is all of reality. For him, he said he had, as a teenager, very advanced guy, he always wanted to know what reality was, and that's what drew him to it, number one. And number two, he realized that nothing material could bring him lasting happiness and peace. Nothing. No relationship, no monetary success. And I feel in the same boat. It's like you get something and that doesn't bring the lasting happiness. So it seemed, and I was talking to him, well, okay, for you, what brings lasting happiness? It seems that this reuniting with the true self, this consciousness that we actually are, not the character that we've kind of been trained to be, that once you start aligning with that, that's where lasting peace and happiness can come. It almost is like trying to get into that state of the near-death experience or the psychedelics user or meditator. It's aligning with the consciousness that is experiencing your life that can start to lead you down the path of more lasting happiness, because that's your true nature. Anything material is external. And if everything is consciousness, then there's nothing outside of consciousness. So it kind of makes sense that if you are striving for this thing outside of yourself, that you would never you would never experience lasting happiness, because that thing outside of you is actually illusory. It's an illusion. It doesn't exist. So it's a recontextualization of a lot of things to think about happiness. And I think just the recognition of, oh, wait, maybe I am not Mark. I am not Mark. I am experiencing Mark. And what is Mark? Mark's a body and a series of thoughts. Those are just perceptions and sensations. In the end of my book, I get into this. What is the I that is experiencing Mark? That is the true self. Mark is just like this vehicle, I guess. That's kind of where I'm arriving on it. So the true self is the one that's having the experience. So just like having that recognition, whether it's in meditation or just walking down the street of like, I'm not actually Mark, I'm experiencing Mark. What is that which that is experiencing Mark? What is that thing, that entity, that awareness? Okay, you align with that. And I think things start to happen. I can't prove that yet, but I've noticed it with people and in my own life. The more I align with that true consciousness and recognition of what I am, I think the happier I am, or the less suffering I have. And I think just good things have started to happen. So that's one. Another implication is around world peace. I talk about this in terms of how we treat each other, and that's how I close the book, is that, yeah, my book is a scientific book, but all the science is pointing towards the idea that materialism is wrong. Consciousness isn't coming from matter. It's not coming from the brain. And if that scientific idea is wrong, it has existential implications for how we think about our life and how we treat people. So this isn't just some science book, and that I want it to be both a science book, but also an implications book, even though it's just at the very end. How would we treat each other? It's actually not rational to treat someone poorly if you buy into this idea. It becomes irrational. Why would you inflict harm on someone that is actually you? So I mentioned altruism, which is the idea that we like to help each other. That's an altruistic act. In evolutionary biology, it's a very problematic thing. It's because evolutionary biology says it's survival of the fittest. So why is there this thing of wanting to help people? And there have been some theories of, well, it helps when the collective is trying to help others because you're promoting the survival of genes. It's not well understood. Under this argument, altruism is actually selfishness, because by helping another person, you're helping yourself. The highest form of selfishness is altruism. So that makes so much sense why people would want to be altruistic. That has massive implications for individual relationships, but also world peace, I think, of how can we exist or coexist on this planet in this universe together. So to me, that's like really critical insight. There are a few others that these things bugged me in psychology when I was a student. The meaning of love. What is love and what is beauty? Like, lust makes sense because from an evolutionary perspective, we want to survive to reproduce, and lust would encourage that. But love, is it necessary for that? Do you need it? No. And evolutionary theory is all about like, well, what is required for you to survive to reproduce? Love is sort of this thing that exists. It's ubiquitous. Everyone experiences it. People strive for it. And yet we can't fully explain it using evolutionary theory. If we take out biology and evolutionary theory from the picture and we say the nature of consciousness itself, when people have no brain activity, what are they experiencing? They're experiencing pure unconditional love. What do people report on some psychedelic trips? It's the same thing. Reduced brain activity, they're experiencing this love thing. Maybe that is the true nature of our own being. And it transcends anything biological. And that's why it's hard to come up with a biological explanation for love. It's not something that you experience per se. It's actually what you are at the core. So that is a mind-blowing thing for me, because I always tried to understand, well, how is my body producing this sensation? Well, maybe it's just like our actual nature. Beauty is another thing that was even harder to explain through evolution. Why do I find the San Francisco Bay beautiful? Why is that evolutionarily beneficial? I don't need that to survive to reproduce. And yet beauty is also ubiquitous. Everyone experiences beauty. They see a painting that's beautiful, or a mountain, or a sunset, or something. That, again, is explained by this, where Rupert Spira says this very well, the non-dual philosopher I mentioned. He regards beauty as consciousness recognizing itself when that self is an object, whereas love is consciousness recognizing itself when that self is a being, whether it's a person or an animal or something. So these things, again, are like transcending biology. These are major, major ideas, which, again, they come from the simple flipping of consciousness doesn't come from matter. Matter is an experience within consciousness.
That was friggin' beautiful, man. I loved all that.
Thank you.
For sure. Yeah, so well put. I agree with all of that, and I would just use different words to try to describe it from my own life experience. I just wanted to add that I heard, and I don't know this, but I heard that Darwin's book, his research showed that actually nature was collaborative, and only part of that book, the last little bit, was when it came down to it, then it was like survival of the fittest, like when it absolutely had to, like they didn't, like nature never actually sought that out. But what we did is our culturally or universities, they just took that last bit and magnified it. So I can't confirm whether that's true or not, but it makes sense to me. Because the way that I describe it a lot of the time is like, you're in the jungle, and when, a beaver is a beaver, the beaver is going to like what it does. It chops down trees, it builds a little thing, and, he has a great time, and all of the forest benefits. But when the beaver is just doing things that he's not meant to do, he's trying to be an eagle, he's going to suck at it. He's going to just jump off the cliff and hurt himself. And it's not collaborative within the forest. So when we start to think about tuning into what feels good to us, and one of the ways I kind of say this is like, whatever fulfills you. I think Picasso had a really amazing quote about the meaning of life. And it says, the meaning of life is to find your gift. The purpose of life is to give it away. And that's you recognizing who and what you are from your own being, from you. And also like fulfillment when we're going through life. And Jim Carrey had a great quote saying, I wish everybody could be rich and famous so they can know that that's not the answer. And put it another way, it's like, from my research, I think that you're never going to be truly fulfilled from what I can get. You'll be truly fulfilled when you realize what you can give. And when you start to do that a little bit more, and whether it's a natural gift, it's your job, right? And you made an invention that improves people's lives. You could be an investment banker, and it makes you happy to help people support their financial future because that's what you like to do. Doesn't matter what it is, but it's from what can I give? How can I make your life better? And if you just sit with that idea, it just makes sense. Like, it just makes sense. If you're going around thinking about what can I get? How can I rip people off? How can I get more? It's empty. And, we talked a little bit at the beginning about the book that I wrote, Zen Athlete. And basically one of the principal ideas in that book is that you don't become whole, happy, and fulfilled when you win the Stanley Cup or you become the tennis champion. You're whole, happy, and fulfilled the whole entire way, because once you win that championship, you know, a couple hours later, maybe a couple days, maybe a week, you go back to being you. You know what I mean? And you can look at the trophy and you can be all stoked about it, but you're not going to have that continuous happiness. It's going to be, what fulfills me? How do I want, like, that art is an expression of you. If your business is successful, it's an expression of you. But if you're thinking about how can I give and how can I empower people, that actually feels good because you're empowering them in a way that you enjoy, that is of you, and you see people light up. And so it's like, how I don't push people down, I lift them up. And when you do that, it just makes sense as far as fulfillment goes. And so what I wanted to ask is, you know, from you thinking about yourself 2 years ago, you know, what would you say to yourself to kind of open the doorway to this other idea, another thought? And if you could empower people listening or the world with an idea or a belief or maybe even like a thought experiment to allow them more freedom and more happiness and more fulfillment from the research that you've done, what would you offer to them?
I think this notion of the lack of separation at an actual deep fundamental level, where we are at the core the same but having different experiences, that to me is a totally mind-blowing, world-changing idea, because it changes how we approach everything. It implies that we're not finite beings and that we're not separate from each other. So if we're not finite, that means we don't actually die. Maybe this physical form does, but the body kind of transitions. There's an analogy I really like that I reference in the preface of my book from Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, a philosopher. He says, imagine that reality is like a stream of water, where water represents consciousness. And each of us is like a little whirlpool. I'm one, you're another. Localizations of the water, but made of consciousness. When the whirlpool dissolves, it just changes form. The water doesn't leave from the stream. It just changes into a new form within this broader stream of consciousness. So it's like we're all water as part of this big stream. So it just changes the whole perspective of like, what am I doing here? How am I interacting with people? The person on the cashier, whoever, some person that one might have considered to be insignificant is no longer insignificant at all. I mean, everyone's just water. Everyone's just consciousness. It really, to me, this idea of equality and that we're all one, I used to roll my eyes at those ideas, even though I like to treat people well. I always wanted to treat people well, but it was from the materialist perspective of, well, I just want to, I'm not sure why. Now at the core, it's, okay, well, this is another being, another experience of consciousness. That's a big deal, no matter who they are. And by the same token, some person who by material means is like a big deal is maybe brought down a little bit on a relative basis of, well, this is another person of consciousness, just like the person that I walk by on the street. So to me, it's like, it's brought this idea of equality into real life. But I would, for people who are just getting into this, the reason I wrote the book is really for people like that who could have an introduction, and people who have been exposed to it as well, but really for people who have never been exposed to have an introduction to all these ideas. Because for me, it was the exposure to this new base of evidence that I didn't know existed. All of a sudden, I had to reconcile these things that I had heard. What is it? Is it all fraud? Is it not? So just being exposed to the ideas, I think it opens the door a little bit. And it's just, I think educationally, to know that people are studying these things is super important. But what starts to happen over time, excuse me, is that the implications start to kick in of, oh, wait a second, maybe this is real. And as I was going through my process, when I learned about the things at first, I would dismiss them, and then I would come back and like, wait a second, there was this fact I learned. How do I reconcile it? So it was this back and forth. I'd learn about something, then I would forget about it. I would learn, forget. And then I got to a point, it was like the event horizon in the black hole. You know, the point where once you go past that point, you're sucked into the black hole. I got to a point where I couldn't come back to where I was before. So it's not an overnight process if you're new to this. If some of your listeners are just hearing it for the first time, if this is your first exposure, you heard a lot, and it will take time to process. And it's a process for people. I mean, for me, it's been 2 years, and I'm still absorbing it and learning how to live on a day-to-day basis. And I think we all do. So that would be one thing I would encourage. Going back to my old self, what would I say to my old self? Well, I think my old self was very rational and was looking at implications based on what I thought was real. So I wouldn't fault my old self. It was just that I had never been exposed to the information. And I was what I thought was well-educated and was around people who were well-educated, but these ideas were not part of that upbringing. And it's another reason I wrote this, is I want it to be part of the conversation. I want this to be not only for day-to-day people, because I think it will have a major effect on certain people in the same way that it affected me. I wanted to take my year's worth of nonstop research. I was just doing nothing but researching. Social life, out the window, working, researching. I wanted to make that simple for people and put it into one place where they could get that in one easy place. Where was I going with this? I lost my train of thought, Matt. What were we talking about? Me 2 years ago?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
if you could and even if you could just give them like any kind of like belief system, because it's good wherever you are, whatever you've experienced is great. But if you could add like one of the nuggets and just implement, whether it's a belief or like an idea, one plant for them.
Okay. Well, I think the one is the idea that we're fundamentally not separate, even though we look like we're separate. The other, I think I would go back to the life review. That stands out to me. People in a near-death experience where they have these are impaired brains or no brain function at all. And they're experiencing their life in a flash, judging themselves for how they acted, and experiencing, in some cases, how they affected people through that other person's eyes. That is extremely profound for how we think about our day-to-day actions. And if we just remember that, even once a week, of, oh, wait, maybe this life review thing happens, and maybe for some reason we don't remember it or we don't have conscious awareness of it, but it happens. And if for a second that's real, is there any harm in treating people as if that's real? I don't think there's any downside to it. And in the best case, that what I'm talking about is real, and we're one consciousness, and that you are promoting the evolution and advancement of consciousness by treating others well. I think that's a really big one. And then maybe there's another idea, which is this when we get to psychic abilities and human potential, that we can do so much more than we're trained to think we can do. And we can use that power, hopefully, for good things.
Awesome. 100% agree with all that, man. Well, I appreciate you and your work and going ham 2 years of research to bring this out from, your perspective, because I think that's important to bridge the gaps on both sides and to share what we learn. And if it's useful, if we learn something in our lives and we feel better, we feel more free, we feel more happy, and we can share that freely with others and encourage them to, just be a better person. And hey, this worked for me, if you want it, great. Hopefully it can improve your life. Before we go, I just want to ask you if there's anything that you wish that I had asked you, anything that you want to touch on before we go. You can feel free to elaborate as long as you wish. And if not, then you can just share where we can get a hold of you and some final messages for the listeners.
Sure. So I remembered what I was going to say. I was saying that I think the book will be great for the everyday listener, someone like me 2 years ago, to have that compressed amount of research in one place. I had a friend who read the advanced reading copy the other day. He read it from San Francisco to New York, the whole thing. He said he got up to go to the bathroom once, but read the whole thing. That's perfect. That's what I want, is for it to be concise and something that people can absorb quickly. But also, I wrote it for the academic community, because we are all trained through our educational system, and that system is not teaching these things and is glossing over this. Number one, we have no idea where the mind comes from, that it's an open question. It's an open question. We should be talking about that very actively. And number two, that there's evidence suggesting that the reason Science Magazine hasn't been able to figure out what is the biological basis of consciousness, the number two question, the reason they can't figure it out, in my mind, is that we're asking the wrong question. The question says, what is the biological basis of consciousness? It assumes that there is a biological basis of consciousness. If there's no biological basis in the first place, we're never going to solve the hard problem of consciousness. So this needs to get into the academic community. So you'll see in the book, I show opposing opinions of some people who are very prominent, very smart, and they say there's no evidence. And then you have Jessica Utz, she was the 2016 president of the American Statistics Association. She was asked by Congress and the CIA in 1995 to evaluate all the evidence from the government program and elsewhere. And she concluded in her report that's publicly available, I quote it 3 times in the book because I don't want it to let it slide. She says, based on the evidence, if you apply the standards that we apply to any other area of science, psychic functioning has been well established. This was in 1995. So there's a major rift in the academic community, and I would love for this to cause a massive debate, because this stuff it's like not talked about. And there are a lot of academics that I talk to who are really interested in it, and other friends of mine in the academic community who are studying this, they get emails all the time from people of like, hey, I can't tell my colleagues about this, but I'm super interested in telepathy or precognition. I had one that I talked to, Dr. Julia Mossbridge. She told me this on her podcast. She was at Northwestern getting a PhD, and she studies precognition, this idea that consciousness knows the future before it happens. When she was on her tenure track, she was told to take that off her resume because it was too controversial. So that is not the right kind of encouragement in my mind if we want to have open study. So that's another message that if you pick up the book, you'll see that early on in the book that I draw this, I show the rift, that there's a major debate that many people haven't heard of. I didn't even know it existed. And I would love for that debate to become very active. And even if people are talking about my book and totally disagree with it, if they're talking about the ideas, then it's a total win. So I was a bit provocative at times in the book, and I mentioned certain people's names. I am not trying to be derogatory towards anybody. I have respect for all scientists on both sides, but I want the debate to be open because of all these implications we talked about, Matt. And it's the things that you talk about in your coaching, it sounds like, and on your podcast. These implications about society will come out of this science. And if we're suppressing certain things, or not even suppressing, if we're just not talking about them, then we can't get to the implications so easily. So for me, these implications we talk about of lack of separation, I would have dismissed that 2 years ago because I had no basis for thinking about it. What do you mean we're not separate? Yeah, we are. Like, I can see you. We're not the same. We're separate. We have similar DNA because we're humans and Homo sapiens, but we're fundamentally different. I had no basis for thinking about the lack of separation. And now there's a framework. Well, consciousness doesn't come from the brain. It's the basis of all reality. It exists beyond space and time. We're all in this stream of consciousness together. That's a framework for thinking about it. So I'm hoping that people, this will give people a platform for thinking about the ideas and a platform for debate. And if you are, if you're interested in the book or know people who might be interested, I have a feeling that your listeners, based on just hearing you talk, Matt, that your listeners probably are going to be more receptive than others. But your listeners may have friends who have never heard of these things before. And I wanted to create a book that you could hand to a friend that's never heard of these ideas, that's written hopefully in a grounded way, that's backed by evidence, that's logical, where you have to deal with this evidence of how do I deal with it? I just don't believe it. It's fraud or it's real.
Amazing, man. Well, I personally appreciate that because I came up with the worldview where I could give a crap about the science. I just know it. I don't care. So then I can now reference your book. You'd be like, look, you don't believe that you influence your reality, that we're all one, that there's other states. Go check out my buddy's work. Mark, read that thing and then come back to me and we'll have an open discussion. But yeah, I really appreciate what you're doing. And I totally believe and feel the same way about the academic community, that this, for me, I didn't understand why, that it wasn't researched. It's in, you look at any ancient histories, it's all there, it's always talked about. And I think that the left brain is the part of us that can be controlled. You can be controlled and manipulated by filling it all up, defining what reality is and measuring it. But on the right side, that's the part connected to source, yourself, creativity, expansiveness, oneness, connection with all things. And we need to be open to all ideas. And the bottom line is we don't know what's going on. Rationalistic, reductionist science is great to a degree, but when you have these states of mind, or you look at reality and you look at quantum physics, the truth is we don't know what's going on. We don't know where consciousness comes from. We don't know way more than we know. If we know one, then we don't know a number that doesn't exist, 900 trillion. There's so much more we don't know than we do know. So if we can humbly look at all ideas in an open discussion in the spirit of collaboration, for benefit of all people, including the person you're discussing it, to seek understanding from the person you're having a discussion with, not to be right, just to hear their view, to roll it around in your own nugget and to share something back and mutually have respect and seeking understanding, we're all going to grow as individuals, as communities in the planet, because, if we are all one, then peace is important. And that's what we need to strive towards, first within ourselves, peace and kindness. And that's, a never ending thing. But when you start to bring the power back, what are your values? What do you want to create here? And you connect to this spirit, to this source, or this idea that you create, you're going to have these experiences come into your reality to promote you being in aligned with that stream, you know, kind of like being in harmony with nature in whatever way you want to share it. So I just appreciate you writing the book and your work. And anything else you want to say?
I think we covered a lot.
I don't think you left your website. Did you?
No, my website is my name, markgober.com. The book comes out on October 9th in hardcover. It will be available on audiobook and ebook as well. I think we covered everything. And I would love, you know, if your listeners are interested in the ideas, to support it in the ways we discussed, to let friends know about it. And I mean, when I wrote the book, my original inclination was, why don't I just make this available for free? I have a job. I never intended on being an author. That's not why I'm doing this at all. I was advised that it would not be a good idea to do that because the book will have more perceived credibility if you have to pay for it. But my point is, what I'm trying to do is to get the ideas out there as much as possible. So if your listeners feel compelled by this talk and by the ideas that you talk about a lot, Matt, I think this is hopefully going to be a good platform.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you. Thanks for coming on. Stay in touch, and thank you everybody for listening.
Thank you, Matt.
See you, brother.